In the frozen Colorado high country, Abigail Mercer was feared by an entire town, not because she was evil, but because she knew how to heal what others could not understand. When a preacher, a corrupt sheriff, and a railroad scheme turned her kindness into a crime, Abigail stood on the edge of losing her land, her freedom, and her name. But when a wounded stranger named Wyatt Callahan stumbled into her life, two broken souls found the courage to face the darkness together. This is a Western story about truth, healing, dignity, and the power of knowledge against fear. If this tale touches your heart, please like, comment, share it with someone who believes in justice, and subscribe for more emotional frontier stories.
Lost on the Colorado high country didn't care about the railroad, or the law, or the whispers in the valley. It just bit. Abigail Mercer stood in the gray light of dawn, her breath rising in thin, ragged plumes against the October chill. The soil of Broken Spur was mostly flint and stubborn rock, but her small plot half a mile outside town held onto the dampness. She knelt by the roots of a wild elderberry bush, her fingers raw but steady. Beneath the yellowing leaves, a small shadow stirred, a winter swallow, its wing twisted at an awkward, unnatural angle, lay panting against the frozen dirt. Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't call it a curse. She just reached out her hands, mapped with the faint green stains of crushed clover and juice, closed around the tiny trembling heartbeat. With a small smooth splinter of pine and a thread of hemp, she naped the broken bone. Her movements were quiet, rhythmic. The bird stopped struggling. It didn't know medicine, but it knew the absence of malice. Life is just a life, she thought, her thumb brushing the bird's gray feathers before she set it gently into a hollowed-out gourd filled with dry straw. The dirt doesn't ask for a name before it lets a seed grow. Then, the wind shifted. From a half-mile down the trail, the heavy tongue of the Broken Spur method began to swing, clang, clang, clang. It wasn't a call to prayer, not at 7 on a Thursday morning. It was a rhythmic iron hammer pounding against the silence. A sound that always made the skin on Abigail's arms prickle. It was the sound of a town gathering its righteous anger. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her heavy wool skirt. She needed salt. She needed unbolted flour. The frost was coming on hard, and winter in the high country didn't negotiate with an empty pantry. The walk into town was always the longest half-mile of her week. Spur was 300 souls living in wood shingle shacks built on the promise of gold that had run dry 5 years back. Now the town lived on spite and the rumor of the Denver line coming through. As Abigail's boots hit the dusty boardwalk of Main Street, the rhythm of the town fractured. Mrs. Alcott, pulling her young daughter by the apron strings, dived straight into the dry goods store, slamming the door until the glass rattled. Two miners outside the livery stable stopped spitting tobacco. They just stared, their eyes tracking the hem of Abigail's skirt as if looking for hoofprints instead of leather soles. "Witch," a voice hissed from the shadow of the blacksmith forge. It was a low, wet sound, the Mercer witch. Abigail kept chin up, her silver-gray eyes looked straight ahead, focusing on the faded sign of Miller's Grocery. 3 days ago, Sammy Miller had been burning up. His skin was the color of old tallow, his tongue dry as a boot tongue from the typhoid fever. Doc Boone had stood over the boy's bed, patted his pockets for his bone saw, and told the father to call the undertaker. Abigail had gone in through the back door. She had bathed the boy in willow bark tea and pressed cool bruised skullcap leaves to his temples for 18 hours straight until the sweat broke. Sammy was running in the dirt today, but his father, Jed Miller, wouldn't look Abigail in the eye when she walked onto his porch. "Store's closed to you, Abby," Jed said. He stood in his own doorway, his hands tucked deep into his canvas overalls. His face was red, the shame of a weak man turning into the anger of a scared one. "Reverend Blackwood says we ain't to trade with folks who carry strange fire. Says Sammy's healing didn't come from the Lord." Abigail stopped 2 paces from the step. She didn't raise her voice. In the high country, a loud woman was a target, a quiet woman was a threat. "The willow bark grew in the creek," Abigail said, her voice low, even, and carrying the steady rhythm of a pendulum. "The skullcap grew in the shade of the pines. God put 'em both there before your church ever had a foundation. If a man closes his eyes to what's right in front of him, he isn't being pious, he's just being blind." Jed looked down at his boots, his jaw working. "The law's the law, Abby." "Blackwood says the law doesn't stop a fever," she cut in softly. "Won't keep your boy warm this winter when the flour runs out." "I came for salt, Jed, not a sermon." He didn't move. He just reached behind the door and pulled it shut, the latch clicking home like a pistol cocking. Abigail stood on the boardwalk for 3 heartbeats. The street around her was empty now, but the curtains in every window were twitching. She turned to leave, her basket light in her hand, when the heavy thud of iron-shod boots echoed behind her. Sheriff Clayton Briggs didn't walk, he loomed. He was 48 years of bad whiskey and old grease, his silver star pinned crooked on a greasy leather vest. Behind him stood 2 deputies, their hands resting easy on the walnut grips of their Colt revolvers. "Abigail Mercer," Briggs barked, his voice rattling the dry boards beneath their feet. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at her throat, where a small silver amulet her mother had beaten from a Mexican coin hung on a leather thong. "Hold up right there." Abigail turned slowly. Sheriff Briggs reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded square of heavy parchment. It wasn't town stationery, the blue seal of the territorial court at Denver, but the ink at the bottom was fresh, dark, and signed in the sprawling, arrogant hand of Reverend Josiah Blackwood. "You're being served, Abby," Briggs said, thrusting the paper toward her chest. "Legal summons, practice of witchcraft, public endangerment, and unlawful medicine without a license." 7 property owners signed it. "Court set for 14 days from tomorrow." Abigail didn't reach for it. "I've lived on that ridge 5 years, Clayton. My husband built that cabin before the gold went bust." "Your husband's dead?" Briggs sneered, dropping the paper at her feet when she wouldn't take it. It hit the dirt, the blue seal catching the pale sun. "And the law says an unmarried female using ungodly means to influence the community can have her property forfeit to the township. Blackwood's taking the land back for the public good. You lose that trial, you're off the ridge you try to run, and it'll hunt you down like a stray heifer." The trap was perfect. It had 2 teeth. One was the town's fear of what they couldn't explain. The other was the legal description of her homestead, the very acreage where the surveyors had driven their red cedar stakes for the new Denver rail line last month. Gail looked at the paper in the dirt. Her heart was a hammer against her ribs, but her face remained stone. She didn't cry. She didn't curse him. She knelt, picked up the parchment, and folded it into a neat, tight square. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron. 14 days, she said, her silver eyes locking onto Briggs' watery glare until the lawman looked away toward the livery stable. "I'll be there, Sheriff. Make sure the Reverend brings his Bible. He's going to need something to hide behind." She turned her back on them and walked away. Her stride didn't hurry. On the ridge above the town, the wind was picking up, blowing the dry yellow grass across the small fence of the graveyard. Abigail stopped there before she went back to her cabin. She didn't go to the house first. She went to the corner where the pine trees blocked the north wind. The headstone was just a slab of gray river rock. "Thomas Mercer, 1839, 1873. A man who walked true." She knelt down, her fingers tracing the rough-cut letters her own chisel had made 3 winters ago. She took the small sprig of sage she had pulled that morning and laid it on the earth. "They're coming for the land, Thomas," she whispered to the grass. "They're using the church to do it." She didn't stay long. Numbness was a luxury for people with food in the larder. Inside her cabin, the shadows were long and purple. Abigail lit a single tallow candle, its tallow-scented smoke filling the room. She sat at the heavy oak table, the one Thomas had hauled 60 miles from the sawmill, and pulled her mother's journal from the iron box under the floorboards. The pages were old bread paper, yellowed and crisp around the edges. Some lines were written in the sharp, blocky English her father had insisted on, others were in the sweeping, rhythmic symbols her mother had learned in the Georgia hills before the long march west. She turned to the very last page, where her mother's ink had gone brown like dried clover. Abigail ran her fingers over the words, reading them aloud to the empty room, her voice steadying the tremor in her hands. "The white man builds a fence around the grass and calls it his," she read, the English words tasting like iron on her tongue. "Builds a house with a steeple and says God only lives inside. But the medicine doesn't belong to the fence, and it doesn't belong to the steeple. Knowledge is a gift given to those who watch the dirt. When they call you a witch, Abigail, it is because they have forgotten how to listen to the world, and they are afraid of any woman who still can." She closed the book. The latch on the iron box clicked shut. Outside, the darkness came down, fast, cold, and absolute. The wind howled through the chinks in the logs, a lonely high country sound that usually meant she was safe from the town for at least one more night. Abigail reached for her mending, her mind already counting the days until the 14th. 14 mornings left to find a way to fight a preacher, a sheriff, and a town that preferred a holy lie to a hard truth. Then, from the dark safety of her horse corral out back, came a sound that wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, panicked splintering of cedar pine, followed by the heavy, wet thud of something large collapsing into the dirt. The splintering of wood hung in the cold air. Then silence. Abigail didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She just set her jaw. Walked to the fireplace, lifted the heavy iron poker, and took her husband's Winchester rifle from the mantel. She checked the chamber. One brass cartridge gleamed in the dim light. She snapped it shut. She picked up the lantern. She opened the heavy oak door. The wind hit her first, biting through her wool shawl. She raised the lantern. The yellow light spilled across the frozen dirt, reaching the edge of the horse corral. The top rail was snapped clean in half. Beneath it, a dark mass lay crumpled in the frost. It wasn't a wolf, it wasn't a stray calf, it was a man. Abigail kept the rifle raised. She stepped off the porch. Snow crunched under her boots. She moved slow, deliberate. A wounded animal was dangerous. A wounded man was worse. She got close enough to see the blood. It was a lot of it. It stained his heavy canvas coat, dripping down to pool black against the white frost. He was lying face down. One arm was flung out. His fingers were dug into the dirt, like he'd been trying to pull himself toward her porch before the darkness took him. Abigail lowered the rifle. If she left him, he would be dead by morning. The cold would take him if the bleeding did. If she helped him, she was harboring a man with a fresh bullet hole. In a town looking for a reason to hang her, a bleeding stranger was a rope already tied. Looked at the town below. No lights, just shadows and judgment. She looked back at the man. Herbs don't choose, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. They don't ask for a name. They just heal. Abigail leaned the rifle against the fence post. She knelt in the snow. She grabbed the man by the collar of his coat and his good arm. He was big, heavy with muscle and bone. She braced her boots. In the dirt, she pulled. It took her 20 minutes to drag him. Inside, her lungs burned. Her arms shook. She kicked the doors shut against the wind and dropped the bolt. She rolled him onto his back by the hearth. The firelight caught his face. He was in his early 40s. Deep lines cut around his mouth and eyes. A thick, jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, disappearing into his collar. It was the face of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and learned to live there. His breathing was shallow, a wet, ragged sound. Abigail stripped off her shawl. She grabbed her shears and cut away the heavy canvas coat. She cut through the wool shirt beneath it. The wound was high on his right shoulder. The bullet had gone in clean, but it hadn't come out. It was lodged deep against the bone. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury. She went to her iron pot. She poured boiling water into a tin basin. She gathered clean linen rags, a bottle of clear corn whiskey, and a pair of long iron forceps. She knelt beside him. She poured the whiskey straight into the wound. The man's body arched off the floor. His eyes stayed closed, but a low, guttural groan tore from his throat. His left hand shot out. His fingers locked around Abigail's wrist like an iron vise. She didn't pull away. She didn't fight him. She just looked at his clenched jaw. "I have to get it out," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Eddie, hold on to me if you need to, but don't move." He didn't wake, but his grip loosened just a fraction, an implied trust. Abigail went to work. It was brutal, bloody labor. She found the lead flattened against his collarbone. She gripped it with the forceps. She pulled. The bullet hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. She packed the hole with a thick poultice of yarrow and raw honey. She bound it tight with the clean linen. When it was over, her hands were slick with his blood. She sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. The man was sweating, muttering in his fever. "Billy," he whispered. Name cracked in his dry throat. "Billy, don't run. Stay down." Abigail paused. She dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to his forehead. A man's fever dreams told you who he really was. He wasn't dreaming of gold or whiskey or vengeance. He was dreaming of saving a child. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire. She didn't sleep. She watched him breathe. The sun came up gray and thin. The wind rattled the window panes. On the floor, the stranger took a sudden, sharp breath. His eyes snapped open. They were brown, dark, sharp, and entirely awake. No confusion in them. He didn't thrash. He didn't reach for a gun that wasn't there. He lay perfectly still, assessing the ceiling, the fire, the bandage on his shoulder, and finally the woman sitting 10 feet away with a Winchester across her lap. Abigail met his gaze. She braced herself for the usual reaction, the narrowing of the eyes, the suspicion, the fear, but it didn't come. He looked at her silver-gray eyes. The town called them the devil's eyes. They said she could curse a man with a stare. But the cowboy didn't look away. He looked right through the rumors. He saw a woman, scared, guarded, and fiercely proud. He saw the truth. He swallowed hard. He tested his voice. "Thank you," he said. It was gravelly, dry. Abigail didn't blood. The bullet hit bone, but it didn't shatter it. "You'll keep the arm." He nodded slowly. He looked toward the window. He saw the pale daylight. He knew what a wounded stranger meant to a woman living alone on the edge of a hostile town. He turned back to her. "Do you want me to leave right now?" he asked. Abigail froze. A simple question, but it hit her harder than a physical blow. "Do you want me to leave?" He wasn't assuming he owned the room because he was a man. He wasn't assuming she was a helpless nurse. He was handing her the power. He was giving her the choice. It was a level of respect she hadn't been offered since Thomas died. "If you stand up right now, you'll bleed out before you hit the tree line," Abigail said. Her voice was softer this time. "That's my problem," he said, "not yours. I won't bring trouble to your door if you don't want it here." Abigail looked at the fire. The flames licked at the dry pine. Men take, she thought. They take land. They take dignity. Choices. But this man was offering one back. "My name is Abigail Mercer," she said, looking back at him. "You're in my home and I don't throw dying men out into the snow." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, the tension in his shoulders dropped. He rested his head back against the floorboards. "Wyatt," he said softly. "Wyatt Callahan, and I promise you, Mrs. Mercer, am not dying today." The next morning broke clear and bitter cold. Wyatt Callahan was sitting up. He was propped against the wall by the stove. His face was the color of old ash, but his eyes were clear. He watched Abigail move around the small kitchen. It was quiet, efficient. She didn't waste a step. She handed him a tin cup. Steam rose from the dark liquid. "Drink," she said. "Willow bark and boneset. It tastes like mud, but it'll keep the fever down." Wyatt took the cup with his left hand. He drank it. He didn't flinch at the bitter taste. Obliged before Abigail could turn back to the stove, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Abigail stiffened. Wyatt's left hand instantly slid toward his boot, where she had placed his surviving gear. The instinct of a hunted man. Abigail shook her head at him. She walked to the window, pulled back the edge of the burlap curtain, and looked out. "Martha," Abigail murmured. She unbolted the door. Martha Higgins, the woman who ran the boarding house in town, slipped inside quickly. A blast of cold air followed her. Martha pushed the door shut and leaned against it, her chest heaving. She was a stout woman, usually full of loud laughter. Today her face was drawn tight with fear. "Abby," Martha gasped, pulling off her wool bonnet. "I had to come. The back way through the pines. You're in bad trouble. I have a court date in 13 days. "Martha, I know about the trouble. It's worse than the court," Martha said. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, completely unaware of the man sitting in the shadows by the stove. "They saw your lantern burning all night. Jed Miller's telling everyone you were conjuring. Reverend Blackwood is whipping them into a frenzy. Talking about not waiting for the judge. They're talking about coming up here tonight with torches to cleanse the ridge." Abigail's face turned to stone. The law was one thing. A mob was another. "I'm not leaving my land, Martha," Abigail said. Her voice was flat. "Final, Abby, please, they're scared." "Scared men don't think, they just burn things." Martha reached out and grabbed Abigail's hands. "You don't have anyone to stand for you. A widow against a preacher? It's a losing hand." From the shadows, a deep, raspy voice broke the silence. "She has a witness!" Martha shrieked, jumping back and grabbing the edge of the table. She stared into the corner. Wyatt shifted his weight. He leaned forward into the light. He looked terrible, bloody, pale, and dangerous, but his voice was entirely calm. "Who in God's name are you?" Martha breathed, clutching her chest. "A man who owes this woman his life," Wyatt said. He looked at Abigail. "Martha, is it? You go back to town. You tell them you came up here to buy some tea. You tell them Abigail Mercer has a boarder, a man fully armed, and if anyone comes up this ridge with a torch, they'll be walking into Winchester fire, not a witch's curse." Martha looked from Wyatt to Abigail. Her mouth opened, then closed. She nodded quickly. "Ill tell," Martha said. Pulled her bonnet back on. "Be careful, Abby. Both of you." She slipped out the door, moving fast. Abigail bolted the door. She turned and stared at Wyatt. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You just put a target on your own back." I already have a target on my back, Wyatt said. He set the empty tin cup on the floor. He looked up at her, his dark eyes serious. I cared what she said. About the trial, about the preacher taking your land. It's town business, Abigail said, turning away to stir the pot on the stove. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want anyone's pity. It's robbery, Wyatt corrected. I used to wear a badge, Mrs. Sir Pinkerton Detective Agency. I've seen men use a gun to rob a train, and I've seen men use a Bible to rob a widow. The second kind is worse, it's cleaner, and they get away with it. Abigail stopped stirring. She looked over her shoulder. You're a Pinkerton. Was, he said. He didn't elaborate. The scar on his neck seemed to tighten. Listen to me. We have 13 days. I need a place to heal where nobody else looking for me. You need a man standing on your porch so a mob doesn't burn you out in the night. And you need a witness in that courtroom who isn't from this town. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over and stood over him. Witness to what? She asked. You don't know me. You don't know what I do. I know you saved a dying man when it would have been easier to let him freeze, Wyatt said. He didn't blink. His voice was firm, carrying a hard, unyielding truth. The law was written to protect people, Abigail. It wasn't written to be used as a weapon by men to strip women of their land. You have the right to stand in that courtroom as an equal citizen. They want to paint you as a monster because monsters don't have property rights. Ill take the stand. Ill swear to your character. Ill swear your medicine is just medicine. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet cabin. That's my offer, Wyatt said. I stay 2 weeks. I fixing around here with my good arm. I stand with you at the trial. In exchange, you keep patching me up, and you tell me the name of the man who shot me. Abigail looked at him. She saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't doing this just out of nobility. He was hunting the man who put a bullet in him. He needed her just as much as she needed him. It was a fair trade. She didn't smile. She just gave a single curt nod. Deal. Over the next 4 days, the rhythm of the cabin changed. Wyatt was a man of his word. As soon as the fever broke, he was on his feet. He couldn't lift his right arm above his waist, but he didn't complain. He learned to chop kindling with his left hand. The rhythmic thwack of the hatchet became the new morning sound. Abigail watched him from the kitchen window. She watched the way he worked, deliberate, patient. He didn't curse when he missed the block. He just reset his stance and swung again. Action spoke louder than courtroom oaths. A man who respected the wood he chopped was a man who respected the world around him. On the 5th day, they went out to fix the broken corral fence. The wind was biting. Wyatt held the heavy cedar rail in place with his hip and his good arm, while Abigail drove the iron nails home with a heavy hammer. Bang, bang, bang. Hold it steady, she said, her breath plumbing in the cold air. It's steady, Wyatt grunted, his boots planted deep in the frost. He worked in a comfortable silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence Abigail was used to in town. It was the silence of two people who understood that words were mostly used to lie, and sweat told the truth. When the rail was secure, Abigail stepped back, dropping the hammer into her canvas bag. She looked at his shoulder. Blood was seeping faintly through the wool of his shirt. You tore the stitches, she said flatly. Fence needed fixing, he replied. Wiping his brow with his left forearm, he looked past her toward the rows of dried, frozen plants in her garden. What are those? He asked, pointing his chin toward a patch of thorny stems. Abigail looked. She expected a joke, a superstitious comment. But he was just looking, asking. Hawthorn, she said. Walked over to the fence line, brushing the frost off a dried berry. The berries are good for the heart. If a man's blood is thick or his chest is tight, you steep it in hot water, not too hot, or you kill the medicine. Wyatt walked up beside her. He looked at the plant. He didn't touch it. And the ones by the porch, he asked. Comfrey, she said. Her voice changed when she talked about the plants. The hard defensive edge melted away. For broken bones, it knits the tissue back together. It's what I put on your shoulder under the bandage. It pulls the heat out. Wyatt listened. He didn't interrupt. He looked at the plants, then looked at her. It's not magic, he said softly. It's just knowing how to read the dirt. Abigail looked up at him. Their eyes met. The wind blew a strand of black hair across her cheek. Whit didn't reach out to brush it away. He kept his distance. He kept his respect. It's not magic. That evening they sat at the oak table. Supper was venison stew and hard biscuits. The fire crackled in the hearth. The only light came from the lantern between them. Abigail set a sharp hunting knife on the table between them to cut the bread. She didn't hesitate. She trusted him with the blade within arm's reach. Implicitly, Wyatt slowly, he looked up from his bowl. "You cook good, Abby," and he said. "It wasn't polite flattery. It was a fact my mother taught me," she said, breaking her biscuit. "She was Cherokee. My father was an English lawyer in Boston. She taught me how to feed a man. He taught me how to argue with one." A small, genuine smile touched the corner of Wyatt's mouth. It changed his whole face. It made the scar look less angry. "Sounds like the picked a fight with the wrong woman," Wyatt said. Abigail looked at the flame in the lantern. "We'll find out in 8 days," she said. Looked across the table at the scarred cowboy. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin didn't feel empty. And for the first time since the summons was handed to her, Abigail Mercer didn't feel like she was standing in the dark alone. The frost held the valley in a tight fist. It was the kind of cold that made the pine trees snap in the dark. Inside the cabin, the fire burned hot and steady. Wyatt was sitting at the table, running an oiled rag over the mechanism of his Colt revolver. His right arm was still stiff, but the color had come back to his face. He moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man who knew exactly what his body could and couldn't do. Abigail was at the sink, washing out the breakfast tins. She looked out the window. The sun was pale, the sky was the color of bruised iron. Then she saw movement at the edge of the tree line. She stopped washing. Dried her hands on her apron. She didn't reach for the rifle this time. The movement was too small, too close to the ground. A figure stepped out from behind a heavy spruce. It was a boy. He was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. The sleeves rolled up past his wrists. His boots were scuffed. He kept looking over his shoulder, terrified, not of the woods, of the town behind him. "Someone's coming," Abigail said softly. Wyatt stopped wiping the gun. He slid the cylinder shut with a soft click. He didn't stand up, but his posture changed. He became entirely still. Abigail opened the door. The cold air rushed in. Sammy Miller stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He was 9 years old. Just 4 days ago he had been a ghost tangled in fevered sheets. Now his cheeks were pink with the cold. His breath puffed in the air. He looked at Abigail. Then his eyes darted to the dark interior of the cabin. He saw the shadow of a man sitting at the table. Sammy swallowed hard. He didn't run. "Sammy," Abigail said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be up here." "If your father catches you, he's at the livery," Sammy interrupted. His voice was high, shaky, but determined. "He's getting the wagon fixed. He thinks I'm behind the woodpile." The boy took a step closer to the porch. He kept his hands hidden behind his back. "You need to go home," Abigail said. Her chest felt tight. She wanted to hug the boy. She wanted to check his forehead for a fever. But she kept her distance. To touch him would just give the town more fuel for their fire. Sammy didn't leave. He brought his hands out from behind his back. He was holding a small, messy bundle of dry weeds. A few late-season purple asters were mixed in. The stems were crushed. The flowers were wilted from the frost. It was the most beautiful thing Abigail had seen in 3 years. He held them out. "I wanted to say thank you," Sammy said. He looked down at his boots, then back up into her silver-gray eyes. He didn't see a witch. He just saw the woman who had put cool water on his head when he thought he was burning alive. "Pa says I'm supposed to talk to you. He says you're bad." "But I remember," Abigail couldn't speak. "I remember you singing," Sammy said softly. "When the hurting was worst, you sang. And it stopped hurting so much. Bad people don't sing like that." Sammy walked up the wooden steps. He laid the crushed flowers on the edge of the porch. He didn't wait for her to say anything. He just turned around and ran back toward the tree line, his oversized coat flapping in the wind. Abigail stood in the open doorway. The cold wind bit at her face. She looked at the flowers on the floorboards. She dropped to her knees. She picked them up, carefully, like they were spun from glass, and then she broke. It wasn't a loud sound. It was just a sharp intake of breath, a quiet, ragged sob. She pressed the dry flowers to her face. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of the town's hatred. She had built a wall of stone around her heart. But a 9-year-old boy with a handful of weeds had just walked up and dismantled it with one sentence. Inside the cabin, Wyatt Callahan sat at the table. He didn't get up. He didn't walk over and put a hand on her shoulder. He gave her the one thing she needed most. He gave her space. He looked at the floor, giving her dignity in her vulnerability. Hate is taught, Wyatt thought. Listening to the soft sound of her crying, but gratitude is born in the bone. He understood now, completely. A child's love is pure. It cuts through the thickest prejudice. Sammy Miller didn't care about town politics. He didn't care about the preacher's sermons. He just knew who had saved his life. When Abigail finally stood up, she wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She closed the door. to the sink and put the flowers in a small glass jar filled with water. She didn't look at Wyatt. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was thick. "You don't have to be," Wyatt said quietly. "Not here." Abigail stopped. She rested her hands on the edge of the sink. She looked out the window at the empty tree line. "They teach them to hate so early, Wyatt," she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a tragic fact. They teach them to fear anything they can't control. But Sammy, he slipped through the cracks. Wyatt holstered his revolver. He stood up. He walked over to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. Set one on the table for her. "The boy knows the truth," Wyatt said. He sat back down. "That's why they want to run you out, Abby. You're a mirror they don't want to look into. Every time they see you, they're reminded that their doctor failed. Their prayers failed, and a woman living alone on a ridge succeeded." Abigail turned around. She picked up the tin cup. She let the heat soak into her palms. "I'm not trying to prove them wrong," she said. "I just want to live on my land sometimes." "Just living is an act of defiance," Wyatt replied. The afternoon faded into evening. The wind died down. The cabin settled into a comfortable shared quiet. Wyatt helped her chop the evening wood. His shoulder was healing fast under her care. The comfrey pulse was doing its work. For supper, they sat by the fire. The lantern was turned low. Wyatt stared into the flames. The orange light danced across the scar on his neck. He had been quiet all evening. A heavy, thoughtful kind of quiet. Abigail sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in his canvas coat. "My shoulder is mostly knit," Wyatt said suddenly. The silence broke, like a dry twig. "It is," Abigail agreed. She pushed the needle through the heavy canvas. "The muscle take time, but the wound is closed." "Then it's time I held up my end of the bargain." Wyatt turned his head. He looked straight at her. "I told you I'd give you the name of the man who shot me." Abigail stopped sewing. She rested her hands in her lap. She waited. Didn't blink. It was Clayton Briggs. The sheriff. Abigail felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She hadn't expected to sink, but a lawman. It complicated everything. "The sheriff of Broken Spur shot a stranger in the dark?" she asked. Her voice was level. She didn't doubt him. She just wanted the pieces to fit. "He didn't shoot a stranger," Wyatt said. His voice dropped an octave. It sounded like grinding stones. "He shot a man who recognized him. A man who knows exactly what kind of butcher is wearing that tin star." Abigail watched his face. The pain in his eyes had nothing to do with the bullet hole in his shoulder. It was an old pain, a deep, rotting kind of pain. "What did he do, Wyatt?" she asked softly. Wyatt leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at his hands. "A year ago, in a territory further south, a place called Bent Creek." Wyatt's voice was hollow. "It was a Cheyenne camp. Mostly women, old men, children. The army wasn't involved. It was a local posse, men hired by cattle barons to clear the land. Briggs was riding with them." Abigail stopped breathing. She knew the stories. Mother had told her stories of the long walk, the blood in the dirt. "I was working for the Pinkertons then," Wyatt continued. "I was sent to investigate the land disputes. I arrived 2 days after the massacre. I found one survivor, a little boy. He couldn't have been older than Sammy." Wyatt swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. "His name was Billy. He had hidden under a wagon. He saw their faces. He saw Briggs." Wyatt looked up at Abigail. His eyes were shining in the firelight. "I promised that boy'd keep him safe. I promised him would go to the federal marshal. Locked him in a hotel room in Denver. I stood guard outside the door." Wyatt stopped. He took a slow, jagged breath. "But they didn't come through the door. They paid a chambermaid to slip poison into his supper tray." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Abigail closed her eyes. The cruelty of men never ceased to break her heart. She thought of Sammy. She thought of a child dying alone in a hotel room. "I quit the agency the next morning," Wyatt said. His voice hardened. The sadness turned to cold, forged iron. "I've been tracking the men in that posse ever since. Briggs was the last one on my list. I found him 3 days ago. He saw me in the alley behind the saloon. Wait to talk. He pulled his iron and fired." Abigail looked at the man sitting by her fire. He wasn't a drifter. He was a ghost hunting other ghosts. "You didn't come to Broken Spur by accident," she said. "No, and now he knows you're alive." "Yes." Wyatt leaned back in his chair. He met her gaze. "Our fights are the same fight now, Abby. Briggs is the muscle, Blackwood is the brain. They're using the law to cover up their crimes. But the law only works for them in the dark. We're going to drag them into the light." Abigail picked up her needle. She pushed it through the heavy canvas. She pulled the thread tight. 14 days, she said. 9 left, riding into town tomorrow," Wyatt said. "I need to know what the preacher is actually planning." Abigail didn't argue. She just nodded. The pact was sealed in blood and truth. Broken Spur looked different in the daylight, to a trained eye. It wasn't just a town, it was a crime scene waiting to happen. Wyatt rode Abigail's old roan mare down Main Street. He kept his coat collar turned up against the wind, his hat was pulled low. The bullet hole in his shoulder ached with the rhythm of the horse's gait, but he ignored it. He tied the horse at the rail outside the saloon. He didn't go in. He walked down the boardwalk, his boots making a heavy, measured sound on the wood. He was watching the faces. He was watching the lines of power. Town had a rhythm. You just had to find the pulse. Wyatt stopped across the street from the telegraph office. He bought a bitter apple from a street vendor and leaned against a post. He watched the door. For an hour, nothing happened then. The pulse jumped. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stepped out of the telegraph office. He was a tall man, dressed in an immaculate black broadcloth suit. His beard was gray and neatly trimmed. He looked like a man of God. But Wyatt didn't look at the suit. He looked at the man's hands. Blackwood was holding a yellow telegraph slip. He folded it quickly, too quickly. He tucked it into his inner breast pocket. He looked left and right before stepping onto the street. He walked straight toward the assayer's office. Wyatt pushed off the post. He tossed the apple core into the dirt. He followed Blackwood, not closely. Just a shadow in the morning crowd. Blackwood didn't go into the assayer's office. He went into the alley beside it. Wyatt slipped into the narrow space between the general store and the bank. He moved silently. Pinkerton training was bred into the bone. Through a gap in the wooden siding, Wyatt saw Blackwood meet with a man wearing a bowler hat and an expensive wool overcoat, a city man, a Denver man. Wyatt strained to hear over the wind. The survey lines are finalized, the city man was saying, his voice was impatient. The Central Pacific Board wants the land secured by the 1st of the month, Blackwood. We're not rerouting the track around one stubborn woman on a ridge. You don't need to worry about the Mercer woman, Blackwood replied smoothly. His voice dripped with practiced calm. The town is taking care of it. I filed the paperwork for forfeiture based on public endangerment. The trial is next week, shall be evicted. The town takes the deed and I will sign it over to your company as agreed. Make sure it happens, the city man snapped. We're paying top dollar for that right-of-way. If her name is on that deed when the track layers arrive, the deal is dead. Wyatt stepped back from the wall. The pieces slammed together in his mind. It was never about witchcraft. It was never about Sammy Miller's fever. About geography. Abigail Mercer's cabin sat right in the middle of the only level grade through the valley. It was the perfect, unavoidable path for the new railroad line. Blackwood was using the town's religious fear as a smokescreen to steal a fortune. Wyatt turned to leave the alley. He didn't make it 2 steps. Well, look what the buzzards brought back. Wyatt stopped. He turned around slowly. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stood at the mouth of the alley. His hand was resting on the grip of his Colt. 2 deputies stood behind him, looking nervous. Briggs didn't look nervous. He looked like a man who had just found a rat in his grain bin. Wyatt didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at Briggs. Sheriff, Wyatt said. His voice was casual, flat. Briggs took a step closer. He looked at Wyatt's right shoulder. You heal fast, Drifter, of bet a month's pay. You were rotting in a ditch by now. I found a good doctor, Wyatt said. Briggs' eyes narrowed. I know where you've been staying, Callahan. I know. You're up on that ridge with the witch. You're a fool. You're standing in the way of progress. You take your horse and you ride out of Broken Spur. Today you stay, and you'll hang right beside her. Wit didn't move. He took 1 step forward, just one. Changed the entire gravity of the alley. The 2 deputies shifted uncomfortably. I remember Bent Creek, Clayton, Wyatt said. His voice lost a shout. It was a low, deadly whisper. I remember the blood in the dirt. I remember the boy. Briggs' face went entirely white. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent panic. You don't know what you're talking about, Briggs hissed. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Wyatt said. He locked his eyes onto the sheriff's. In the ghost you didn't kill, Briggs, and I'm going to watch you burn, both of you. Wyatt didn't wait for a response. He walked straight toward the men. The deputies parted. Stepped aside. A guilty conscience makes a coward out of a bully. Wyatt walked out of the alley, mounted the roan, and rode out of town. When Wyatt returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the ridge. The sky was bleeding orange and purple. He walked inside. Abigail was sitting at the table, grinding dried roots in a stone mortar. She looked up. She saw the look on his face. You found something, she said. Wyatt took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He sat down across from her. It's a land grab. Abby, Wyatt said bluntly. Blackwood isn't a fanatic. He's a businessman. Your land sits right on the survey line for the Denver Railroad. The railroad company is paying him to clear the title. He's using the witchcraft trial to seize your property legally. He expected her to gasp. He expected outrage, shock. Abigail didn't blink. She just kept grinding the roots in the mortar. The stone made a rhythmic scraping sound. Grind. Scrape. Grind, No, she said quietly. Wyatt, stop. Stared at her, Abigail set Tess down. She stood up. She walked to the corner of the room to a heavy oak chest at the foot of her bed. Pulled a small brass key from the chain around her neck. She unlocked the chest. She reached past the folded quilts and pulled out a small polished wooden box. She walked back to the table and set it down in front of Wyatt. She unlocked the small box. Inside were stacks of heavy parchment. They were perfectly preserved, bound with silk ribbon. Wyatt reached out. He untied the top ribbon. He unfolded the thick paper. It was a federal land patent, signed and sealed by the General Land Office in Washington, D.C., dated 1871. It granted the acreage to Thomas Mercer. Underneath it was a deed of transfer, legally binding, transferring sole ownership to Abigail Mercer upon his death in 1873. But that wasn't what shocked Wyatt. The deeds were stacks of legal correspondences, letters from the territorial governor's office, transcripts of property laws, meticulous handwritten notes citing federal statutes regarding the rights of widowed landowners. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and precise. Wyatt looked up at her. His mind was struggling to catch up. You wrote these, he said. My father was an attorney in Boston, Abigail said. Her voice was calm. It held the quiet pride of a woman who knew her own worth. He had a library of over 1,000 books. I read every single one of them. I drafted his briefs. I researched his precedents. He told me I had a better legal mind than any of the partners in his firm. Wyatt stared at the papers. Why? Because my mother was Cherokee, Abigail said softly. She looked down at her hands. And because I wear a skirt, there wasn't a bar association in the country that would let a mixed-race woman stand in front of a judge. They would let me clean the courtroom, but they wouldn't let me speak in it. She looked back up at Wyatt. Her silver eyes were fierce in the lantern light. Thomas knew what I was, she said. He was a farmer, but he respected a mind. When he got sick, he made sure the federal deeds were bulletproof. He knew the town would try to take the land from a widow. He made me study the territorial property laws until I knew them backward. Wyatt sat back in his chair. He looked at the woman across from him. He had thought she was a victim holding on to her pride. He had been completely wrong. She was a loaded gun, just waiting for someone to pull the trigger. A woman with knowledge is what terrifies them most, Wyatt, Abigail said quietly. Tap the stack of federal papers. They call me a witch because it's easier to burn a monster than it is to debate a scholar. Blackwood thinks has walking into a local magistrate's court to bully a helpless widow. He thinks the town's fear will override the law. Wyatt looked at the federal seal on the deed. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time Abigail had seen him truly smile. It was a dangerous, wolfish look. A local justice of the peace can't overturn a federal land patent, Wyatt said, his detective mind racing. It's out of their jurisdiction. If Blackwood tries to seize this land, he's committing federal fraud. The railroad will drop him the second they smell a federal investigation. Exactly, Abigail said. She closed the wooden box. I have the law on my side. I have the papers. I just needed one thing. What? A witness, she said, looking straight into his eyes. A man who isn't intimidated by a preacher or a sheriff. One who will stand there and force the town to listen while I read the law to them. Wyatt stood up. He reached across the table and extended his hand. Mrs. Mercer, Wyatt said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. It will be my honor. Abigail reached out. She took his hand. His grip was strong, rough with calluses, and completely equal. She didn't let go immediately. 9 days, Abigail said. 9 days, Wyatt agreed. The trap was set. But this time, the preacher and the sheriff were the ones walking into it. The clock on the mantel ticked, a heavy brass sound. 4 days left. Outside, the wind tore through the pine branches. It sounded like a train rushing past in the dark. Inside, the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. Abigail sat at the heavy oak table. The lantern wick was trimmed low to save oil. The light cast long, shifting shadows across the federal land patents and the legal statutes. She had been staring at the same page for an hour. Her eyes were burning. Her shoulders felt like they were cast in lead. She rubbed her temples. The words on the parchment were blurring together. For 3 years, she had fought this town with silence. She had kept her head down. She had grown her herbs. She had minded her own business, but silence hadn't protected her. It had only given them an empty canvas to paint their fears on. She had to stand in front of them and speak. A sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion hit her. It wasn't just physical. It was the bone-deep weariness of being hated, of having to prove your right to exist. Day after day, she dropped her pen. It clattered against the wood. She buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry. Crying took energy she didn't have. She just sat there, trying to hold the pieces of her resolve together before they shattered completely. From the corner of the room, a chair scraped. Wyatt had been sitting by the stove. He was sharpening his hunting knife. He stopped. He didn't ask what was wrong. Fool asks a drowning person if they are wet. He stood up. He walked to the stove, picked up the enameled coffee pot, and poured a tin cup full of black, bitter coffee. He walked over to the table and set it down next to her elbow. He didn't say, "It's going to be all right." Hollow words were an insult to intelligent people. Instead, Wyatt pulled out the chair beside her, not across from her. Beside her, he sat down. He leaned his forearms on the table, looking at the same scattered papers she was looking at. "The law is a heavy thing to carry alone," Wyatt said. His voice was low, a steady rumble in the quiet room. Abigail slowly lowered her hands. She looked at the steam rising from the coffee. "Father used to say, the law is a shield," she whispered. Her voice was brittle. "But out here it feels like a wall I have to climb over while they shoot at me from the top." "Then well, tear the wall down," Wyatt said. He didn't offer a grand speech. He just sat there, solid, unmoving. True support doesn't always require action or advice. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to sit in the dark with someone so they don't have to bear the weight of it by themselves. Abigail picked up the cup. The heat grounded her. She took a sip. The bitterness of the coffee cut through the fog in her mind. She looked at the cowboy sitting next to her, the scar on his neck, quiet strength in his jaw. For the first time, she felt the terrifying, beautiful relief of not having to be strong all by herself. Just past midnight, the dogs at the edge of the property started to bark. Not a frantic, attacking bark. A low, warning growl. Wyatt was out of his chair in a second. The exhaustion vanished from his posture. He grabbed the Winchester from the corner. He moved to the window, keeping his back to the wall. He peeled back the edge of the burlap curtain. "One rider," Wyatt muttered, moving slow. Coming up the front trail, Abigail stood up. She moved away from the lantern light. A quiet knock hit the door. 3 sharp taps. Pause. Then 2 more. Wyatt looked at Abigail. She nodded once. He unbolted the door and pulled it open. The rifle leveled waist-high. Doc Boone stood on the porch. The old doctor was shivering. He was wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a shield. Snow was dusting his gray beard. He looked at the barrel of the rifle, then up at Wyatt's face. He swallowed hard. "I need to see her," Boone said. His voice trembled. Wyatt stepped back. He lowered the rifle but didn't put it away. Boone stepped into the cabin, took off his hat. He looked at Abigail standing by the table, surrounded by her legal papers. The old doctor looked down at the floorboards. Guilt hung off him like a wet blanket. "They're pushing the trial up," Boone said softly. "Blackwood doesn't want to wait. He's convened the town council. They're going to hold the hearing the day after tomorrow." Abigail didn't flinch. "He's rushing because he knows the railroad surveyors are getting close. He needs the deed cleared." Boone nodded miserably. He walked to the table. He set his leather medical bag down. He popped the brass clasps and reached inside. He pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. It was his patient log. He slid it across the table toward Abigail. 42, Boone said. "It's Sammy Miller's chart. I wrote down everything, the temperature, the delirium, and I wrote down that my medicine failed." He looked up at her, his eyes watering in the lantern light. "I wrote down that your willow bark and skullcap brought its fever down. It's medical proof, Abby. It proves you're a healer, not what they say." Abigail looked at the ledger. Then she looked at the doctor. "You wrote it down," she said quietly. "Are you going to read it to the town?" Bone's shoulders slumped. He took a step back. "I can't, Abby. You know I can't. Wood has half the town in his pocket. If I stand up there against him, they'll ruin me. They'll stop coming to my clinic. I'm an old man. I have nothing else." The silence in the cabin turned sharp. Abigail felt a cold sickness in her stomach. It wasn't the malice of bad men that destroyed the world. It was the silence of good men. Wyatt stepped forward. He set the rifle on the table. The sound of the heavy wood hitting the oak was like a gunshot. "You're giving her a piece of paper," Wyatt said. His voice was a rasp of pure disgust. "A piece of paper doesn't talk back when a preacher calls it a lie. A piece of paper doesn't have a spine. I'm giving her the proof," Boone protested, his voice cracking. "More than anyone else in town is doing." "Explicit value," Don Wyatt fired back. He kept up into Gert's man's. "An educated man's silence is just a loaded gun handed to a fool. You know the truth. You know she saved that boy. By keeping your mouth shut to save your own skin, you're tying the noose around her neck yourself." Boone shrank back. "I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm sorry." He turned and practically ran out the door, fleeing into the snow. Wyatt watched him go. He closed the door and drove the iron bolt home. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with cold anger. Abigail reached out and pulled the ledger toward her. She ran her fingers over the leather cover. "He's terrified, Wyatt," she said softly. "Fear is a choice," Wyatt said. He turned around to face her. "He chose his comfort over your life." "But we have the chart," Abigail said. She looked up at him, her silver eyes steady. "Between this, the federal land deed, and you on the stand, we have the truth. And the truth doesn't need Doc Boone's courage, it just needs a voice." Wyatt looked at her. He saw the iron resolve underneath her exhaustion. She wasn't breaking, she was forging. "Day after tomorrow," Wyatt said. "Well, be ready. Fire is a coward's weapon. It does the killing while the man walks away in the dark." The smell hit Wyatt first, sharp, acrid. Bitter scent of burning pine pitch mixed with the unmistakable sweet smoke of dried sage. Wyatt was out of his bedroll before his eyes were fully open. He grabbed his boots and his gun. "Abby," he shouted. Abigail was already out of her room. She had thrown a heavy wool blanket over her nightgown. Her eyes were wide with terror. They threw open the front door. The sky wasn't dark. It was glowing a fierce, unnatural orange. 50 yards from the cabin, the herb garden was a wall of flames. The dry cedar fencing had caught first, acting as a wick that carried the fire straight into the dense, dry rows of medicinal plants. "No," Abigail screamed. It wasn't just a garden, it was her life's work. It was her mother's legacy. Medicine that kept the valley alive. Even when the valley hated her for it, they ran. The heat hit them like a physical blow. Wyatt grabbed a heavy burlap sack from the porch, dunked it in the rain barrel, and threw a bucket of water to Abigail. They fought the fire like demons. Wyatt beat the flames with the wet burlap, ignoring the searing pain in his healing shoulder. The smoke choked them, it blinded them. Abigail poured water on the unburned edges, desperately trying to create a fire break to save the comfrey and the echinacea. They fought until their hands were blistered and their lungs burned. It took an hour to kill the beast. When the last ember hissed and died under a bucket of water, the dawn was just beginning to break, turning the sky a bruised purple. The garden was gone, half an acre of healing, reduced to black ash and smoking stumps. Abigail dropped the empty bucket. She fell to her knees in the soot. Her hands were black. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. She stared at the charred remains of a hawthorn bush. She didn't make a sound. The silence of her grief was heavier than any scream. Wyatt stood beside her, leaning on a blackened fence post. Gasping for air, he looked around. Fires don't start themselves in the frost. He walked the perimeter of the burn line. His Pinkerton eyes tracked the ground. The snow was melted near the fire, but further out near the tree line he found them. Boot prints. Deep, heavy impressions. Someone had stood there, watching the fire catch. Wyatt followed the tracks to a large pine tree. Pinned to the bark with a heavy iron hunting knife was a piece of paper. Pulled the knife free. He unfolded the note. The handwriting was crude, written in thick black charcoal. "Callahan, the trial is canceled. Bringing federal charges of murder on the witch instead. How did little Billy die in that hotel room? The town will hang her for poisoning, just like you let them poison the boy. Ride out or watch her swing." Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. The paper trembled in his soot-stained hands. The air rushed out of his lungs. It was a masterstroke of cruelty. Briggs had figured it out. He couldn't beat the land deed. He couldn't beat the witchcraft defense if Wyatt testified, so he changed the game. Abigail was charged with a capital crime like murder. The federal land deed wouldn't matter. Her property would be seized as restitution, and Briggs had used Billy. He had taken Wyatt's deepest, most agonizing failure and weaponized it. "You let them poison the boy." The words echoed in Wyatt's head like a death knell. The guilt he had carried for a year roared back to life, a monster unchained. "I am a curse," Wyatt thought, his vision blurring. "Everywhere I go, innocent people die. I try to protect them, and my enemies just use them to get to me. If I stay, Briggs will frame her. Hell hang her just to watch me break. Wyatt crushed a paper in his fist. He walked back to the cabin. He didn't look at Abigail kneeling in the ashes. He couldn't look at her. Poison. He went inside. He pulled his saddlebags off the peg. He started stuffing his spare shirt, his ammunition, and his shaving kit into the leather pouches. His movements were jerky, frantic. The door opened behind him. Abigail stood in the frame. She was covered in soot. Her silver eyes locked onto the saddlebags. Her voice was flat. Wyatt didn't stop packing. He kept his back to her. I'm leaving. I'm riding out. Wyatt threw the cloth-crushed note onto the table. Abigail walked over. She picked up the paper with trembling, blackened fingers. She read the charcoal words. She read the name Billy. She understood instantly. Briggs, she whispered. He's going to charge you with murder, Wyatt said. He finally turned to face her. His eyes were wild, haunted, not witchcraft. Murder, capital crime. He's going to invent a victim, say you poisoned them, and he's going to tie it to me. If I stay here, you hang. It's that simple. He's doing this because of me. He picked up his saddlebags, hung them over his good shoulder. I'm a dead man walking, Abby, and I drag everyone down with me. I couldn't save Billy. I can't save you from this. The only way you survive is if I take my horse, ride out, and draw Briggs away from this town. He took a step toward the door. Abigail stepped into his path. She didn't move. Put the bags down, Wyatt, she said. Abby, move. You don't understand explicit value. I understand perfectly. Abigail's voice cracked like a whip in the small cabin. She reached out and grabbed the leather strap of his saddlebag. You are judging yourself for the bullet of an evil man. You think you are poison. You think you killed that little boy. You didn't. The men who bought the horse killed him. Wyatt swallowed hard. Chest heaved. I was supposed to protect him, and you failed, Abigail said. She didn't soften the blow. She spoke the hard truth because it was the only thing that could save him. You failed, but human beings are allowed to fail, Wyatt. Forgiving yourself is the hardest lesson a person can learn. You're trying to punish yourself by leaving. Wyatt looked away. If I stay, hell hang you. If you leave, hell hang me anyway. Abigail stepped closer. She looked up into his haunted brown eyes. Her silver eyes were blazing with a fierce, unbreakable light. Listen to me, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. For 3 years, men have tried to tell me what to do. They've told me how to pray, where to live, and how to act. Do not use protecting me as an excuse to rob me of my choice. This is my house, my land, and this is my fight. Wyatt stared at her. The frantic energy in his chest began to slow. I am asking you to stay, Abigail said. She let go of the leather strap. She took a step back, giving him the space to decide, not because I need a savior, but because I want you here. You have the right to walk out that door. But if you do it for yourself. Don't do it to save me. Wyatt looked at the open door. He looked at the snow falling outside. He thought of Briggs. He thought of the smug, cruel smile on the sheriff's face. Then he looked at Abigail, covered in soot, her garden destroyed, the town plotting her murder. He was still standing, unbroken. Wyatt let out a long, shuddering breath. He took the saddlebags off his shoulder. He dropped them on the floorboards. The heavy "ud" echoed in the quiet room. Okay, Wyatt said. The frantic haunt in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly clarity. Okay, we stay. He walked over to the table. He smoothed out the charcoal note. Briggs thinks he's playing a new game, Wyatt said quietly. He looked at Abigail. He wants to bring federal charges. Fine. Well, give him a federal trial. Legal papers ready? Abigail wiped a streak of soot from her cheek. A fierce, proud smile touched her lips. They're ready, she said. Good, Wyatt said. He picked up his revolver and checked the cylinder. Tomorrow morning, we walk into town, and we burn their house down. The town hall smelled like wet wool, chewing tobacco, and nervous sweat. It was a Tuesday morning. The room was packed to the walls. People were standing in the aisles, leaning against the frosty windows, waiting for a show. They had come to see a witch burn, or at least, to see a proud woman broken. At the front of the room sat Reverend Josiah Blackwood. He was seated behind a heavy oak table, acting as the appointed justice of the peace. He wore his finest black coat. His hands were steepled under his chin. Pious, patient, untouchable. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stood off to the side, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was thin, hungry smile. He thought he held all the cards. He thought Wyatt was already halfway to the state line. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open. The cold wind blew in, rustling the papers on Blackwood's desk. The crowd turned. The murmurs died instantly. Replaced by a thick, heavy silence, Abigail Mercer walked in. She didn't wear mourning black. She didn't wear the drab homespun of a penitent sinner. She wore a deep blue dress, the collar pinned high and neat. Black hair was braided tightly. She carried a leather satchel in one hand. She walked with her spine straight and her chin level. She didn't look at the floor, she looked at the judge. Beside her walked Wyatt Callahan. He hadn't run. He walked with a slight limp, his right arm resting stiffly by his side. But his eyes were sharp. Lethal, he scanned the room, making eye contact with the men who had signed the petition. One by one, they looked away. But it wasn't Abigail or the scarred cowboy that made the town hold its breath. It was the person holding Abigail's other hand. 9-year-old Sammy Miller walked down the center aisle. He was wearing a clean white shirt. His hair was slicked back with water. Terrified of the crowd, but his grip on Abigail's hand was rolled tight. Jed Miller, sitting in the third row, jumped to his feet. His face went purple. "Sammy," Jed yelled, stepping into the aisle. "Get over here!" "What do you think you're doing with that woman?" Wyatt stepped between Jed and the boy. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stood there, a solid wall of muscle and quiet menace. "The boy called witness, Miller," Wyatt said. His voice carried to the back of the hall. "Territorial law says a witness of sound mind can't be obstructed from taking the stand. You sit down or I'll sit you down." Jed looked at Wyatt's eyes. He looked at the badgeless, dangerous confidence of the man. Jed swallowed hard and sat back down. Abigail led Sammy to the wooden chair beside the defense table. Knelt down. She ignored the 300 people staring at them. She only looked at the boy. "You just tell the truth, Sammy," Abigail whispered. "You don't have to be brave, just honest." Sammy nodded. He climbed up into the big chair. Blackwood banged his wooden gavel. "Bang, bang. This is highly irregular," Blackwood announced. His smooth voice had a slight edge to it now. "Abigail Mercer, you are charged with public endangerment, practicing ungodly arts, and maintaining a hazard to the moral safety of Broken Spur. The penalty is forfeiture of property. How do you plead?" Abigail stood up. She unbuckled her leather satchel. "I plead that this court is a sham," she said clearly. Her voice rang off the wooden rafters, "and I have the evidence to prove it." She pulled out Doc Boone's thick leather ledger. She slammed it down on the table. "This is the medical log of Dr. Thaddeus Boone," Abigail stated last week, page 42. "He details the exact botanical treatments I used on Samuel Miller, willowbark, skullcap. It is medicine, reverend, documented, proven medicine, not magic." The crowd murmured. Blackwood frowned. "Dr. Boone isn't here to verify that ledger. He doesn't need to be." Wyatt spoke up from the side. "The boy is here." Turned to Sammy. His voice gentle. "Sammy, when you were sick, did Mrs. Mercer cast spells on you? Did she do anything in the dark you didn't understand?" Sammy gripped the arms of the chair. He looked at his father, then at the preacher, and finally at Wyatt. "No, sir." Sammy squeaked. He cleared his throat and tried again louder. "No, sir, she just gave me water. And bitter tea. She wiped my face with a cold cloth." "Did she hurt you?" Wyatt asked. "She saved my life," Sammy said. His voice didn't shake this time. "It was the purest sound in the room. Doc Boone said I was going to die. Crying, but Mrs. Mercer stayed awake with me for 2 days singing to me." Sammy looked right at the reverend. "Witches don't sing like that. She's a good lady." A heavy silence fell over the hall. Several women in the back pews looked down at their hands. The ugly narrative was cracking. "You can argue with a lawyer. You can't argue with a child who survived the fever." Blackwood's face flushed. The trial was slipping away from him. He banged his gavel again. "The boy's testimony is noted, but the charge of public endangerment stands," Blackwood declared, his voice rising. "The community has signed a petition. 7 landowners claim your presence lowers the value and safety of the ridge. Property must be forfeit for the public good." Abigail reached into her satchel. She pulled out the federal land patent with the blue seal. "There will be no forfeiture," Abigail said. Her voice was ice. "Because you do not have the jurisdiction, Josiah." She held up the paper. "Explicit value, this is a federal land patent." Abigail read the room like a seasoned attorney. "Signed in Washington, under the Homestead Act of 1862 and the widow's property rights statutes of this territory. This land belongs to me. A local justice of the peace cannot seize federal land based on a civilian petition. If you try to strike my name from the county register, you are committing federal fraud, and the penalty for that is 10 years in a federal penitentiary." The room erupted. Men began shouting. Women gasped. Blackwood stood up. His pious mask was gone. His face was twisted with genuine panic. Toward the sheriff. Clayton Briggs stepped forward. He unhooked his thumb from his belt. He pointed a thick, shaking finger at Wyatt. "Don't listen to her." Briggs roared over the crowd. "She's lying, and she's being backed by a dirty Pinkerton. That man right there is Wyatt Callahan. He's a hired gun. He brings murder wherever he goes. He's wanted for the death of a child down south. He's here to kill us all," the crowd gasped. The fear swung back like a pendulum. Wyatt didn't flinch. He walked slowly to the center of the room. He didn't look at the crowd. He locked his eyes on the sheriff. "I used to wear a Pinkerton badge," Wyatt said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a razor. "Quit, because I couldn't stomach the blood." Wyatt reached inside his coat. Several deputies stepped forward, hands on their guns. But Wyatt didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a folded stack of yellow telegraph papers. "Yesterday morning, I wired the federal marshal's office in Denver," Wyatt said. He held up the papers. "I gave them the sworn location of Clayton Briggs, the man who ordered the massacre at Bent Creek, the man who paid to poison a child witness in a Denver hotel. The marshals are on the morning train, Clayton. They'll be here by noon." Briggs turned pale. He took a step backward, his hand hovering over his gun. Wyatt took a step toward him. "Draw it, Clayton. Draw it in front of 300 witnesses. Federal agent to your list." Briggs looked at the crowd. He looked at his deputies. The deputies slowly backed away, lifting their hands. Nobody wanted to hang for a corrupt sheriff. Briggs' hand dropped from his gun. He looked like a trapped rat. Wyatt turned his back on the sheriff. He looked at the 7 men sitting in the front row, the men who had signed the petition against Abigail. "The railroad is coming," Wyatt said to the men. "Blackwood was going to steal Mrs. Mercer's land, sell it to the Central Pacific and pocket the cash. He was using your fear to make you do his dirty work. You signed that paper. If this goes to a federal judge, you're all accessories to land fraud." Jed Miller stood up. His face was pale. "Draw my name," Jed stammered. "I didn't know about no railroad. I would draw mine too." The blacksmith yelled from the back. Within 30 seconds, the petition was dead. The case was dead. Blackwood slumped down into his chair. The gavel rolled off his desk and hit the floor with a hollow clatter. It was over. The truth hadn't just come to light, it had burned their lies to the ground. Abigail stood at the defense table. She looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. The heavy weight of the past year, the ghost of the boy he couldn't save, seemed to lift from his shoulders. He had finally done it right. He had stood in the light, and he had won. Abigail reached out. She took Wyatt's rough hand in hers. "Be led. Just hold it." They walked down the center aisle together. The crowd parted for them. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. The town of Broken Spur just watched them walk out the doors into the cold, clean air of the morning. 6 weeks later, the snow finally came. It fell thick and heavy, burying the high country in a blanket of absolute white. It covered the mud of the town. More importantly, it covered the black, charred scars of Abigail's ruined garden. A lot can change in 6 weeks. The federal marshals had arrived on the noon train, just as Wyatt had promised. They took Clayton Briggs out of Broken Spur in heavy iron shackles. There was no shootout. There was no blaze of glory for the corrupt sheriff. In the back of a freezing rail car, bound for a federal judge who wouldn't look the other way. Reverend Blackwood hadn't waited for the marshals. He had packed a single carpet bag and vanished into the night. The Central Pacific Railroad, terrified of the scandal and the federal land dispute, rerouted their line 3 miles south. They bought cheap, barren rock, leaving the ridge in peace. The town of Broken Spur was quiet now. Chagrined, Abigail stood on the porch of her cabin. She watched the snowfall. She was wearing a new dress, not the dark defensive wool she usually wore. This dress was the color of pale sage, soft and finely spun. She had a thick wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. From the side of the cabin came the rhythmic thwack of an axe. Wyatt was splitting firewood. His right arm was fully healed. He moved with a fluid, easy grace. He hadn't packed his saddlebag since the morning of the fire. The frantic, hunted look was completely gone from his eyes. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running. He drove the axe into the chopping block, wiped the snow from his forehead, and looked up at the porch. He smiled. It reached all the way to his eyes. Abigail smiled back. It felt strange on her face, but it felt good. A buggy rolled up the trail from town, the horses blowing steam into the cold air. Martha Higgins was driving. Sitting beside her was a woman Abigail had never met before. She was tall, dressed in a sharp, tailored winter coat, with spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose. Behind the buggy, riding a small pony, was Sammy Miller. He was bundled up in a new, heavy winter coat. Wyatt walked over to the porch, brushing the sawdust off his canvas trousers. He didn't wear a suit, he just wore a clean shirt and his old coatist. The buggy stopped. Martha helped the bespectacled woman down. "Abby," Martha said, her face bright red from the cold, beaming widely, "this is Judge Eleanor Vance from the Denver District Court." Abigail stepped off the porch and extended her hand. "Judge Vance, it's an honor to meet you." Judge Vance shook her hand firmly. Her grip was strong. "The honor is mine, Mrs. Mercer," Judge Vance said, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses. "I read your legal filings regarding the land dispute. The brief you submitted to the federal office was brilliant. If you ever decide to move to Denver, I'd hire you as my clerk in a heartbeat." Abigail felt a lump form in her throat. Recognition. Simple, professional recognition. From another woman who had fought the same uphill battle. "Thank you, Your Honor," Abigail managed to say. "But I think my place is right here." Wyatt stepped up beside her. He rested his hand naturally on the small of her back. "Are we ready?" Wyatt asked. They didn't go to a church, they didn't go into town. They walked to the edge of the snow-covered garden, the place that had burned, the place that was resting, waiting for the spring thaw to bloom again. Sammy Miller stood next to Wyatt. The boy reached into his pocket and proudly pulled out two simple hammered silver rings. He had polished them himself. Off in the distance, standing near the tree line, was Doc Boone. Come close. He just took his hat off and bowed his head. Abigail saw him. She didn't wave, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Judge Vance opened a small leather book. She didn't read a long fire and brimstone sermon. She kept it simple. Legal but profound. When it came time for the vows, Wyatt didn't repeat after the judge. He turned to face Abigail. He looked into her silver-gray eyes. The wind blew a dusting of snow across his scarred neck. "Explicit value the day I arrived." "They called you a witch," Wyatt said. His voice was rough but steady as bedrock. "They saw a woman who didn't need them and it terrified them. But I looked into your eyes, Abby, and I saw the truth. I saw a whole, proud, and deeply compassionate human being." Wyatt took her cold hand in his warm one. "I don't promise to save you," Wyatt continued, the words carrying over the quiet ridge, "because you don't need saving. I promise to stand beside you. I promise to always look at you with the eyes of truth, and to protect your right to be exactly who you are, until my last breath." He slid the silver ring onto her finger. Abigail looked down at the metal. Then she looked up at the cowboy who had fallen into her life, bleeding and broken. "I spent my whole life learning how to survive alone," Abigail said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I built walls to keep the world out. I didn't think I needed anyone. I still don't need anyone." She smiled, a tear finally spilling over her lashes and freezing on her cheek. "But I want you, Wyatt," she said. "I choose you, not because I am weak, but because I am finally strong enough to share this life. I promise to be your anchor in the dark. I promise to honor your past and build our future." She took the second ring from Sammy. She slid it onto Wyatt's rough, scarred finger. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Judge Vance smiled, "I pronounce you husband and wife." Wyatt didn't grab her. He didn't dip her. He just raised a hand, cupped her cheek, and kissed her. It was a quiet, profound sealing of a pact made by two people who had walked through the fire and come out, holding on to each other. Sammy clapped, his mittens making a muffled, joyful sound. Martha cheered. Above them the sky began to clear, the heavy clouds parted, and the pale winter sun broke through, casting a bright, pure light across the snow. It was going to be a long winter. There would be hard work ahead. The garden needed to be replanted. The cabin needed more wood. But as Abigail leaned her head against Wyatt's shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she knew the frost couldn't hurt them anymore. Spring was coming, and this time they would watch it bloom together. Spring in the high country doesn't announce itself. It sneaks up, the frost breaks, the mud deepens, and then one morning the world is green. It was May of 1879. The air on the ridge was crisp, smelling of wet pine and turning earth. The black scars of the fire were gone. They had been turned over by a heavy iron plow, buried deep beneath the fresh topsoil. Wyatt Callahan stood at the edge of the new garden. He leaned on a long-handled spade. His right arm was strong again. The muscle had knit back together, thick and capable. He was sweating in the pale morning sun, but he wasn't tired. Good dirt, honest dirt. He looked down at the neat rows in front of him. They weren't just the old herbs. When Wyatt had traveled to Denver to file the final federal affidavits, he had brought something back in his saddlebags. Small, brown seeds wrapped in oilcloth, echinacea the purple coneflower. Now the green shoots were pushed through the Colorado mud, bold, defiant. Abigail walked out onto the porch. She held a steaming tin cup in her hands. She wore a simple cotton dress. Her hair was loose, tied back with a single leather string. She walked down the steps and stood beside him. Taking, she said, looking at the tiny green leaves. They like the hard ground, Wyatt said. He rested his hands on the spade handle. He looked at her, his dark eyes warm. They grow deep roots, a lot like you. Abigail smiled. She handed him the cup of coffee. Just then, the sound of wagon wheels crunched on the trail, leading up from town. Wyatt didn't tense. He didn't reach for his gun. He just took a sip of his coffee. It was a buckboard wagon. Martha Higgins was driving. Beside her sat two other women from Broken Spur, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, and Sarah Miller, Sammy's mother. Parked near the corral, they climbed down, carrying empty woven baskets. They looked a little nervous, a little hesitant. They were walking onto the land they had once called cursed. Abigail stepped forward to meet them. "Morning, Abby," Martha called out cheerfully, breaking the tension. "Morning, Martha," Sarah Mary. Abigail greeted them by name. She didn't hold her chin high to intimidate them. She just offered a quiet, level welcome. True grace is letting people walk away from their past mistakes without demanding they apologize for every single step. Abigail didn't ask for a confession, she just opened the gate. "We came about the chamomile, Mrs. Sir Sarah," Miller said softly. She looked down at her hands. "Sammy's been coughing, just a regular chest cold, but Doc Boone's syrup makes him sick to his stomach. I was wondering if maybe you could show me how to brew that tea." Abigail nodded. She led them to the far side of the garden, where the chamomile grew thick and sweet. "It's not hard," Abigail said. She knelt in the dirt. She showed Sarah which flowers to pinch off. "You take the heads before they fully open. You dry them in the shade. Never the sun, or you bake the medicine right out of them." Mary Gable watched intently. "My husband's joints swell up when the rain comes. Is there a root for that?" "Willow bark," Abigail said. Handed Sarah a handful of chamomile, then pointed toward the creek line. "Boiled for 20 minutes. It pulls the heat right out of the blood." She stood up and looked at the three women. They were listening. Actually listening. Not out of fear, but out of a genuine desire to understand. "Explicit value medicine isn't a secret kept by men in high collars, ladies," Abigail told them, her voice carrying a steady, empowering rhythm. "It grows right here in the dirt. God put it here for anyone willing to learn it. A woman who knows how to heal her own family doesn't have to live in fear of the winter. Knowledge is the only shield you ever really need." The women nodded. They filled their baskets. They asked questions. And for the first time in her life, Abigail wasn't just a solitary healer on a ridge. She was a teacher. An hour later, the women rode back down the trail. It was back to digging. Abigail was sorting the harvested leaves on the porch table. Then a solitary figure walked up the road. He wasn't riding, he was walking, slow and deliberate. It was Jed Miller. Wyatt stopped digging. He rested his boot on the edge of the spade. He watched the man approach, but he didn't intervene. He stayed in the garden. This wasn't his fight to finish. Jed stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked older. The last 6 months had aged him. The blind, righteous anger that used to puff out his chest was completely gone. He took off his battered felt hat. He crushed the brim in his thick, calloused hands, stopped sorting the leaves. She looked down at him. Miss Mercer," Jed said. His voice was ragged. "Wyatt." He nodded to Wyatt in the garden. Wyatt gave a brief, curt nod back, but kept his silence. "Jed," Abigail said. Jed looked at the porch floorboards. He struggled for a moment, his jaw working. Then he looked up. He met her silver eyes. He didn't look away this time. "I was a fool," Jed said. Words came out heavy, like stones dropping into a well. "I let a man in a black coat tell me what to see. I let him make me afraid of the woman who saved my boy's life. I almost let them hang you for it." He swallowed hard. He twisted the hat in his hands. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me, but I couldn't go another day without coming up here. I just wanted to say I was wrong and I am sorry." He stood there, exposed, waiting for the anger, waiting for her to yell or curse him or turn him away. Abigail looked at the man. Remembered the day he had slammed the store door in her face. She remembered the fear in his eyes when he called her a witch. She had every right to turn her back on him. She picked up an iron kettle from the stove just inside the door. She poured boiling water over a handful of dried mint leaves in a tin cup. She walked down the steps. She held the cup out to him. Jed stared at it. He looked at her face, stunned. She didn't demand he grovel. She didn't list his crimes. She answered his vulnerability with hospitality. Offering a cup of tea to an enemy is the quietest, most devastating way to kill a war. Jed took the cup. His hands were shaking. Explicit value hate is a heavy thing to carry, Jed, Abigail said softly. Looked him right in the eye. It makes a man tired. It makes a town blind. An apology isn't a debt you pay. It's a bridge you build so you can walk back to the truth you just crossed the bridge. Now, go home and be a good father to Sammy. Jed's eyes filled with tears. He nodded, unable to speak. He took a sip of the hot tea, tipped his hat to her, and turned around. He walked back down the road. His shoulders were a little lighter, his step a little steadier. Wyatt walked over from the garden. He wiped the dirt from his hands. "You're a better person than I am, Abby," Wyatt said quietly, watching Jed's retreating back. "I would have let him sweat a little longer." Abigail smiled. He leaned against Wyatt's side. He wrapped his arm around her. "No, you wouldn't," she said. "You just would have offered him coffee instead of tea." Later that afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The sky turned a brilliant, violent shade of gold and crimson. A small pony trotted up the trail. Sammy Miller slid off the bareback pad before the pony had even fully stopped. "Mr. Callahan!" Mrs. Sammy yelled, running toward the porch. He was 10 years old now. He was taller, sturdier. He didn't look like a boy who had almost died of the fever. He looked like a boy who owned the mountain. He ran up the steps. In his arm, he carried a small leather-bound notebook. It was new. The pages were crisp. "Look," Sammy said, breathless. He opened the book and shoved it toward them. Inside, written in careful, slightly wobbly cursive, were the names of plants: yarrow, comfrey, sage willow. Besides each name was a rough pencil-drawn sketch of the leaf. "Writing them all down," Sammy announced proudly. "Just like you told me so I don't forget." Abigail took the book. She ran her fingers over the clumsy, beautiful handwriting. "It's perfect, Sammy," she said. "The eye for it. You see the details." "I want to know them all," Sammy said seriously. "So when I get big, I can fix people too." Wyatt knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "Explicit value. You listen to me, Sammy," Wyatt said, his voice deep and earnest. "Learning the plants is the easy part. The hard part is learning how to look at people. You have to look at them without fear. You have to see the truth, even when everyone else is whispering lies. That's the real medicine, you understand?" Sammy looked into Wyatt's scarred face. He nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good man," Wyatt said. He tapped the notebook. "Now go put the pony in the corral. He needs some oats." Sammy beamed and ran off to tend to the horse. Wyatt stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against the wooden rail. Abigail brought out 2 rocking chairs. Thomas had built them years ago. Now they were finally being used together. They sat down as the sun touched the horizon. The shadows stretched long and cool across the ridge. On the wide wooden windowsill beside them, 2 books rested in the evening light. One was Abigail's mother's journal, worn, frayed, filled with the ancient, rhythmic wisdom of a people who knew how to listen to the earth. The other was Wyatt's old Pinkerton notebook, stained with trail dust, filled with the cold, hard facts of a man who had hunted down the darkness in the world. They sat side by side. They didn't clash, they belonged together. 2 halves of a whole truth. Wyatt reached over and took Abigail's hand. His thumb rubbed the smooth, hammered silver of her ring. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. Abigail looked out over the blooming garden, out toward the town that was finally learning how to leave them in peace. "Thinking about my mother," Abigail said. "What about her?" "She used to say that a fire doesn't destroy the dirt. It just burns away the dead wood so the seeds can see the sun." Abigail squeezed his hand. She was right. Wyatt looked at his wife. He saw the silver-gray eyes that the town had once feared. He didn't see magic. He didn't see witchcraft. He saw a woman who had taken the worst the world had to offer and answered it by planting a garden. She was a smart woman, Wyatt agreed. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. They just sat in the rocking chairs, listening to the wind in the pines, watching the stars begin to prick through the fading light. The cowboy and the healer, the past was finally in the ground, and the future was ready to grow. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
As the sun sets over the Colorado high country, and the first green shoots rise from the ashes of Abigail Mercer's burned garden, This story leaves us with a truth as old as the mountains themselves. Fear can destroy, but truth can heal what fear has broken. Abigail was called a witch not because she brought harm, but because she carried knowledge others did not understand. She knew the language of roots, leaves, fever, and pain. She listened to the earth when the town had forgotten how, and because she was a woman, because she was different, because she stood alone on land powerful men wanted. They tried to turn her gift into a crime. But Abigail's journey reminds us that ignorance becomes dangerous when it is dressed in righteousness. A lie spoken from a pulpit is still a lie. A law used to steal from the vulnerable is still theft. And a town that chooses fear over truth will eventually be forced to look at its own reflection. Wyatt Callahan's journey teaches us another kind of healing. He carried the ghost of a child he could not save, believing his failure made him poison to everyone he loved. But Abigail showed him that guilt is not meant to be a prison. A person can fail and still choose to stand again. Redemption does not come from running away from pain. It comes from facing it, naming it, and deciding to do better when the next innocent life is on the line. Together, Abigail and Wyatt prove that love is not rescue, possession, or protection that steals another person's choice. Love is standing beside someone in the fire and trusting them to fight with their own strength. It is giving space for grief, offering courage without control, and seeing the truth in someone when the rest of the world only sees a rumor. Through Sammy, we learn that hate is taught, but gratitude is remembered in the heart. Through Jed, we see that apology can become a bridge back to truth. Through the women who come to Abigail's garden, we understand that knowledge shared freely can become a shield for an entire community. And through Abigail herself, we learn that a woman's wisdom does not need permission to exist. She does not need a title from men who fear her. She does not need approval from a town that once turned its back. Her worth was always there, steady as the roots beneath the frost. In the end, the fire did not destroy her. It only cleared the dead wood so new life could grow. That is the deepest meaning of this story. The world may try to burn what it does not understand, but truth has roots, and roots know how to survive underground. Abigail did not answer hatred with hatred. She answered it with healing, courage, law, mercy, and a garden reborn. And as she and Wyatt sit together beneath the evening sky, we understand that freedom is not simply winning a trial or keeping a piece of land. Freedom is the right to live openly, love honestly, teach boldly, and let the future grow from soil once covered in ash.